My name is William Smith. I'm 53 now, and over the years I've met all kinds of men. Leaders, failures, dreamers, and liars. But there's one friend whose story still lives in my head like a ghost, because of how brutally simple it all was. His name is Joe Lewis. He was 34 when it happened. And if you met him then, you would never have guessed what he carried inside. I've known Joe Lewis for almost 20 years, long enough to see the cracks that formed in him. The way resentment builds like a slow leak behind a wall, until one day the whole damn thing collapses. To most people, Joe was just another man in his 30s. A decent enough guy with a quiet manner, and not much to boast about. But I knew better. I knew the secret life he built, the fortune he concealed behind layers of companies and trusts, the kind of wealth that made him untouchable in rooms where people thought he was powerless. And I also knew the family that refused to see any of it, their contempt, their cruelty, their blindness to the man he truly was. Joe was 34 when everything came to a head. We were sitting in his apartment one night, the blinds half drawn, 2 glasses of bourbon sweating on the table between us. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling like he was trying to find answers written in the cracks of the plaster. "Will," he said, his voice low, "do you know what it feels like to have your own family spit on you, over and over, while you're the only one who could keep them from drowning?" I didn't answer right away. Joe had always been dramatic, but there was something different in his tone that night. It wasn't just bitterness. It was resolve. To understand Joe, you have to understand his family. The Lewises were owed money by reputation, but not by reality. His father, Victor, had inherited a chain of regional hardware stores, a business that thrived for a while in the 80s but steadily lost ground in the new century. By the time Joe was a teenager, the company was a sinking ship, bleeding cash as big box competitors moved into every town where the Lewises once ruled. Instead of adapting, Victor doubled down on his image. The proud patriarch, the man who believed reputation alone could keep a business alive. Joe's mother, Diane, was no better. A socialite in her own mind, she clung to the remnants of status that had evaporated years before, throwing dinner parties they couldn't afford, parading her children around in clothes bought on credit, smiling through the whispers about how far the family had fallen. And then there was Clara, Joe's younger sister. If Victor was pride and Diane was delusion, Clara was entitlement. From the moment she could talk, she was told she was special, destined for better things in the crumbling world around her. She married into money once, divorced, and spent the rest of her time floating between jobs she didn't need and boyfriends she drained. Through it all, she leaned on Joe like he was a family's mule, the one person she believed existed to prop up her lifestyle. They treated him like furniture, useful, silent, invisible. I sat at their dinner table more times than I can count, listening to Victor sneer at Joe's failure to launch, Diane sigh about how he could be doing more with his life, and Clara laugh in his face when he mentioned ideas or plans. They never once asked what he actually did for work. To them, Joe was a family disappointment, the quiet son who never matched their inflated expectations. What they didn't know, and what Joe took pains to hide, was that he built something far greater than the dying empire they worshipped. At 22, while Victor was lecturing him about responsibility, Joe was investing the scraps of his inheritance into startups most people ignored. He had a knack for spotting potential before anyone else, a talent for reading markets and people alike. He built shell companies, trusts, holding firms, all invisible to the untrained eye. By the time he was 30, Joe was sitting on nearly $100 million in assets. And yet he still drove a modest car, wore off-the-rack suits, and let his family think he was barely scraping by. Why? I asked him once. Why let them think you're nothing when you're sitting on more than they could ever dream of? His answer stuck with me. Because, Will, when people show you who they really are, you don't correct them. You don't prove them wrong. You watch. You learn, and when the time comes, you let them choke on the truth. The time came sooner than I expected. It started, as these things often do, with an insult too sharp to swallow. We were at Victor's house, a sprawling brick place outside the city, all faded grandeur and cracked foundation. It was Clara's birthday, and the dining room was filled with her friends, hangers-on, and a handful of business acquaintances Victor was still trying to impress. Joe sat quietly at the end of the table, eating in silence while the conversation swirled around him. Halfway through dessert, Victor leaned back in his chair, smirking. "You know," he said loudly enough for the whole table to hear, "I sometimes wonder what my son actually does with his time. 34 years old, still no wife, no children, no real career to speak of. A man like that ought to be ashamed." The room chuckled nervously. Clara rolled her eyes. Diane sipped her wine. And Joe didn't flinch. He just set his fork down, folded his hands, and stared at his father like he was memorizing the lines of his face. Victor wasn't finished. "Look at your sister. Look at what she's accomplished. Connections, prestige, a real life. And here you are, Joseph, hiding behind vague words about investments and consulting. If you ask me, you're nothing but a drifter." Silence fell. You could feel the weight of it pressing down on the table. I looked at Joe, waiting for him to respond, to defend himself. But he didn't. He simply stood, adjusted his jacket, and said, "You're right, Dad. I am nothing. And maybe that's exactly what you deserve." He left the room, his footsteps echoing down the hall, the front door slamming behind him. I caught up with him outside, the cold air biting our faces. "Joe," I said, grabbing his arm, "don't let him get to you." But Joe's eyes burned with something I'd never seen before. Not pain, not humiliation. Something sharper. He's already gotten to me, Will, for years. But not anymore. They think I'm worthless? Fine. Let's see how they fare without me. That was the night Joe decided to stop hiding, and to stop saving them. The weeks that followed were like watching a storm gather strength on the horizon. Joe rarely spoke about his plans, but I could see the gears turning in his mind. He spent hours in his office, paper scattered across his desk, phone calls whispered behind closed doors. What little he shared with me was enough to understand. His family was teetering on the brink of ruin, and he held the power to either save them or let them fall. Victor's hardware business was collapsing faster than anyone realized. Joe had quietly been financing parts of it for years, funneling money through anonymous entities to cover debts, secure loans, and keep the doors open. Without his invisible hand, the company would have folded long ago. Diane's lifestyle depended on those subsidies too. The house, the parties, the endless stream of credit that Joe quietly paid off behind the scenes. Even Clara, who thought herself as independent, had unknowingly benefited from Joe's support. The investments she bragged about, the cars she drove, the trips she took, half of them were indirectly funded by Joe's quiet interventions. They thought they were standing on solid ground. In truth, they were balanced on Joe's palm, and he was getting ready to close his fist. One evening, he invited me over and laid it all out. Folders, spreadsheets, contracts. The paper trail of a decade's worth of hidden generosity. "Every time they called me worthless," he said, tapping a stack of loan documents, "I was keeping the lights on. Every time they laughed at me, I was saving their reputation. And they never once asked, never once considered that I might be the reason they were still afloat. So what now?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Now!" Joe leaned back, a thin smile on his lips. "Now I stop. Let them see what happens when the ghost in the machine disappears." I wish I could say I tried harder to stop him. Maybe I should have. But the truth is, part of me wanted to see it too. The look on Victor's face when he realized the son he despised had been his only lifeline. The unraveling began quietly. A missed payment here, a canceled contract there. Vendors who once extended credit to Victor's company suddenly demanded cash up front. The bank, which had always been strangely lenient, grew cold and unyielding. Diane's credit cards, once magically balanced, started arriving with mounting debts. Clara's investments began to sour one by one, as Joe withdrew the safety nets he'd secretly set beneath them. At first, they brushed it off as bad luck, but within a month, panic seeped into their voices. Victor ranted about betrayal. Diane wept about appearances, and Clara screamed into the phone at anyone who would listen. Through it all, Joe remained silent, going about his days as though nothing had changed. One night, he and I sat on my porch, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. "Do you think I'm cruel?" he asked me suddenly. "I think you're tired," I said carefully. He nodded. Maybe that's the same thing. But there was no going back. Joe had set the wheels in motion, and the Lewis family was sliding toward a reckoning they couldn't escape. It didn't take long for the Lewis family's world to collapse. Victor's hardware business, the empire he clung to like a badge of honor, crumbled in less than 6 months. Without Joe's quiet injections of cash, the company's debts piled high. Vendors filed lawsuits. Employees walked out when their paychecks bounced. The final blow came when the bank foreclosed on the warehouse properties, assets that had been leveraged to the hilt years earlier. The newspapers ran the headline with cruel delight. Lewis Hardware declares bankruptcy after 40 years. For Victor, it wasn't just financial ruin. It was humiliation. I saw him once during that time in a downtown cafe. He looked smaller, hunched over a cup of black coffee, like it was the only thing keeping him warm. He didn't see me walk in, but I saw him. The proud man who once lorded over his family was now just another broken figure among the city's shadows. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Diane didn't fare much better. Her social circle, always shallow, evaporated as soon as the money dried up. The dinner party stopped. The invitation stopped. She sold jewelry, then furniture, then begged friends for favors that never came. I heard from someone who used to be close to her that she started drinking heavily, wandering through the empty halls of their house muttering about how ungrateful everyone was. The house itself was eventually repossessed. She ended up in a rented condo, curtains drawn, phone calls unanswered. Clara's fall was the loudest. She had built her identity on the illusion of independence, the curated lifestyle funded by Joe's hidden safety nets. When those nets vanished, she crashed hard. The men she leaned on disappeared. Her so-called investments turned to dust. I'll never forget the night she showed up at Joe's apartment, mascara streaked down her cheeks, screaming that he had ruined her life. I was there. Joe stood in the doorway, calm as stone, while she pounded her fist against his chest. "You think you're better than us?" she shrieked. "You think this makes you some kind of god? You're pathetic, Joe. Pathetic." He let her scream, let her rage until her voice cracked. Then he simply said, "I think, for the first time, you're seeing me clearly, and you can't stand it." She slapped him then, hard. The sound echoed through the hallway. But Joe didn't flinch. He just closed the door in her face. After that, the Lewises scattered like leaves in the wind. Victor retreated into silence, Diane into bitterness, Clara into desperation. And through it all, Joe thrived. Not because he flaunted his wealth, but because he no longer carried the burden of saving them. But here's the thing. Freedom, even when it's earned, doesn't come without ghosts. Joe tried to move on. He poured himself into new ventures, traveled more, even allowed himself moments of joy he had long denied. We went on trips together, places he had dreamed of seeing, but always postponed because of his family's endless crises. In Paris, he stood on a balcony overlooking the Seine, glass of wine in hand, and said, this is the first time in my life I feel like I'm living for me." Yet even then, I could see the shadows in his eyes. Revenge, no matter how justified, leaves a scar, and Joe's scar ran deep. He confessed it one night after too many drinks. We were back in his apartment, city lights bleeding through the window. He slumped in his chair, staring at the amber liquid in his glass. "Do you ever wonder if I went too far?" he asked. "You didn't cause their downfall." I reminded him, "You just stopped preventing it." Maybe. He rubbed his temples. But sometimes I hear my father's voice call me worthless, and I wonder if I proved him right. Not by failing, but by becoming the monster he always thought I was. "You're not a monster," I said firmly, but he didn't answer. He just sat there, silent, lost in a war with himself. Months passed. The Lewis family became little more than a cautionary tale in the community, a name people spoke with pity or disdain. And Joe became a myth of another kind. No one outside his closest circle knew the truth about his wealth. To the world, He was still the quiet, unassuming man in the corner. But behind the curtain, he was a force to be reckoned with. I watched him change in those years. He became sharper, more deliberate. He chose his words carefully, his actions even more so. It was as though cutting off his family had unleashed a part of him that had long been restrained. He was no longer the son living under their shadow. He was Joe Louis, a man who would carve his own empire in secret and then reveal its power not through bragging, but through absence. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. For years, his family called him nothing. And in the end, it was by doing nothing, by withdrawing, that he showed them everything. But the story doesn't end there. One evening, 2 years after the fallout, I got a call from Joe. His voice was different, softer, almost uncertain. "Will," he said, "I need you to come with me tomorrow. There's someone I need to see." We drove out of the city, down winding country roads, until we reached a small nursing facility tucked behind rows of oak trees. Joe didn't explain, and I didn't ask. Inside, the air smelled of antiseptic and wilted flowers. We signed in at the desk, and the nurse led us down a quiet hallway. When she opened the door, I understood. Victor sat in a wheelchair by the window, a blanket draped over his legs. His once commanding frame had withered, his face hollowed by illness. He didn't look up when we entered. Only when Joe spoke did his eyes flicker with recognition. "Hello, Dad." The old man's lips trembled. "Joseph." His voice was frail, a whisper of its former thunder. "You came." For a long moment, silence stretched between them. I stood in the corner, unsure whether I was intruding on something sacred or tragic. Finally, Victor spoke again. "They told me you were successful, that you could have saved us. Is it true?" Joe didn't answer right away. He walked to the window, looked out at the dying light. Then he turned back, his expression unreadable. "It's true." Victor's eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name. Regret, maybe, or the last flicker of pride. "Then why?" Joe knelt beside the wheelchair, his voice steady. "Because every time I offered you love, you spat on it. Every time I tried to help, you mocked me. I gave you years of my life, and all you saw was disappointment. So when the time came, I let you live in the truth you created. I let you see the son you thought was worthless walk away." Tears welled in Victor's eyes. He reached out a trembling hand, but Joe didn't take it. He stood, turned to me and said, "We're done here." As we walked out, I glanced back. Victor sat staring at the doorway, his hand still outstretched, a silent plea hanging in the air. It was the last time Joe ever saw him. In the weeks that followed, I noticed something shift in Joe. It wasn't joy exactly, but it was a kind of release. He had faced a man who defined his pain, spoken his truth, and walked away unbroken. And yet, even in freedom, Joe remained haunted, not by guilt, but by the realization that revenge, once tasted, never fully leaves you. It becomes part of your story, etched into your bones. He told me once, "I don't regret what I did, Will, but I wonder if I'll ever know peace." I think about Joe often, about the choices he made and the man he became. People like to believe revenge is clean, a simple balancing of scales. But I watched it unfold in real time, and I know the truth. Revenge is never about balance. It's about revelation. It shows you who people really are, your enemies, your family, and most of all, yourself. Joe revealed his family's hypocrisy, their dependence, their cruelty. But he also revealed his own strength and the cost of wielding it. He became both the executioner and the survivor, the man who walked away with everything and nothing all at once. Sometimes, late at night, I replay those moments in my mind. The slammed door after Clara's screams, the quiet collapse of Victor's empire, the tears in the old man's eyes in that nursing home. And I hear Joe's words echoing like a refrain. When people show you who they really are, you don't correct them. You watch, you learn, and when the time comes, you let them choke on the truth. That was Joe Louis, my friend, my witness to how power hides in silence, how wealth means nothing without dignity, and how even victory can feel like a wound you never stop carrying. And though he would never admit it, I believe deep down Joe wanted one thing above all. Not revenge, not justice, not even respect. He wanted to be seen, to be known, to be loved by the very people who threw his love away. He never got that, but he got something else. He got freedom. And maybe, in the end, that was enough. Please comment, share, and subscribe for more stories like this. And if this is your first time of watching my video, please subscribe to my channel so that you get notified whenever I post a story. Thank you for watching, and bye for now.